Good afternoon, and a warm welcome to yet another event of the Author's Voice, an online lecture program jointly convened by the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, and Gorgias Press. For those who don't know me, I'm Sabine Schmidt, the permanent faculty at the School of Historical Studies representing Near Eastern Studies, and co-hosting today's event with me is my colleague Angelos Haniotis, permanent faculty of classics here at the IIS, Maria Mercedes Tuya, representing digital scholarship at the IIS, and George Kiras, editor-in-chief of Gorgias Press.
We're glad you could join us and hope you're as excited as we are for having the opportunity to embark in a fascinating journey led by books and their authors. A few housekeeping, please put your questions either while the talk is going on or after in the chat section. We are not using Q&A so that we can have only one place where we can look at for the questions. Feel free to do so during the talk. And also please mute your microphone and your video. It's up to you, but at least the microphone, please keep it muted. Thank you. George?
Hello, I'm George Kiras, editor-in-chief of Gorgias Press and a senior research associate at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. I would like to welcome you on behalf of Gorgias to this talk series. We had four talks, we have four talks in this series this year, and this is the third talk. And the series really intends to bring Gorgias authors in conversation with the wider scholarly community and the wider public. So welcome, Ayad, and look forward to hearing from you. Thank you, Sabine.
Okay, so I now have the pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Ayad Al-Ani. Professor Al-Ani is a political scientist. He holds an extraordinary professorship at the School of Public Leadership, Stellenbosch University, South Africa, and he is an associated member of the Einstein Center Digital Future, Berlin. He studied political science at the University of Vienna and economics at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. And his latest book, The Perils and Joys of Writing on the Arabs Before Islam, a highly engaging discussion of Arabia and its civilizations before the rise of Islam from the point of view of a political scientist, was published by Gorgias Press at the end of last year. And today's talk will focus on this book. Professor Ani, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. As mentioned before, I think as a non-historian, I might have to explain myself a little bit on why I wrote this book and why I keep being engaged about this topic. And this will be the only time where it will be personal to some degree. But I think it's important that you understand my position in this situation, perhaps. So it was actually back in the 1980s when I visited my father, who at that time was working for the United Nations in Jordan and in the occupied territories. And I had the pleasure to visit Petra. At that time, that was a very unique place because there were no tourists. And I remember going there, and I was the only one who was there, and that made the place even look greater. However, what came up to my mind is that I had no idea of who those people, the Nabateans, were that built this great civilization. So if somebody like me who went to Iraqi and to German schools and international schools, that was not a topic. And I felt a little bit uneasy because this magnificent civilization was, I could not explain it. And I could not explain this fascinating fusion of Babylonian, Hellenistic, and Roman architecture. So when I came back that evening, I went to my father's library and I found Glenn Bowersook's book, Roman Arabia. And I read it, and I must say, I read the words, but I was really astonished. And I don't think I understood everything of it, because that was for the first time I noticed that Arabs, Arabians played a role in the Roman Empire. They were emperors, they were senators, they were scientists, they were warriors. So that was a totally new aspect of me for me. And I kept in touch with this topic. And later on, I found this interesting book, Rome and the Arabs by Irfan Shahid. And of course, that changed everything for me, because Irfan Shahid was trying to describe the roles of the Arabs in the Roman Empire and in the Hellenistic phase of the Near East. And already this book, which really, I would say, impressed me very, very much, was I felt already here that this is very difficult, that it is not easy to define what the Arabs were. Was that a cultural sphere or not? Did they conceive themselves as Arabs, or was it something else? So decades passed, and it was finally in 2014 where I published the German version of this book. And I tried to focus on some intriguing question for me. One was, I call it the disappearing Arabs. And the question, of course, was here, did Arab exist before Islam as a Kulturnation or cultural nation? That was a definition put forward by Gustav von Grünebaum. So, of course, Arabs were not a nation in a modern sense in that time, but did they exist in a kind of cultural sphere? Was that acceptable? Was that possible? And if we come to the conclusion that there was an Arab element in the Roman and Greek era, then what roles did they play? Did they play a significant role or not? And here, of course, I noticed there's a huge disagreement between the many Western historians and Arab historians. For Western historians, for instance, on my side here, Greg Fisher, who concluded that the Arabs were marginal in this phase and in this area, whereas the Arab historians, of course, see this very differently. However, if you do not concede to some kind of cultural sphere of the Arab element, then the sudden victory of the Arabs against Persia and against the Roman Empire is a great enigma. And of course, this continues to be so. And I found it interesting, for instance, when Philip Hitti wrote about this, saying, you know, who living then could have guessed that such a happening was within the realm of possibility. And Glenn Bowersock later, and I think it was in 2017, concluded in a book that what generated these forces of success for the Arabs are as obscure now as they were at the beginning, and historians have been impeded by the tendentious character of most of the sources for this great upheaval, as well as by their own prejudices, unquote. So you could explain the whole situation differently if you would accept that there was an Arab sphere, but we need to look at that first. Then if there was a joint history between Arabs and the Greek and Roman empires, and this history stretches for about 1,000 years from the invasion of Alexander the Great until the Battle of Yarmouk in 636, then it's interesting to see is when did the Arabs become the other. And that was something that, for instance, Edward Said could not explain. I mean, he explained how Orientalism worked, but he did not dwell too much on the question where this narrative comes from and whether it has had historical pictures or not. And my final question, which I try to answer, is then, why is the stretch of history, although far away, still so political? And also, I must admit, why is it still a Western domain? So in the following minutes, I try to answer those questions, and then also look forward to a possible discussion. One of the very interesting points that Glenn Bowersock made, and which inspired me a lot, was that he assumed that Hellenism strengthened the Arab identity before Islam. So it was not something that was only skin deep, as many conceded, but it was actually helping the Arabs find or define a cultural kind of sphere. And I found this quote here also very interesting, where he says, you know, in many ways, Hellenism prepared the way for Islam for bringing Arabs together and equipping them with a sense of common identity. And if we take this as a working hypothesis, then we should look for the remains of Roman and Greek culture in the Near East. And if we find them, we might even find then Arabic traces associated with that. And of course, the main remains of this history are to be found in Syria, Palestine, but even in faraway places, there are indications that the Roman Empire, for instance, was even stretching outside its official periphery. So we all know, for instance, that Aelius Gallus' campaign in 23-24 BC failed when he tried to invade Yemen with his legion. However, it was only recently that there were excavations at the island of Fezzan. And here we can conclude that Rome did not retreat from Yemen, but still kept an outpost there. So maybe the interaction between the Roman Empire and the Arabian world was much more intense than we can assume right now. And of course, if we look to other places like the Arabian Gulf, this is also a very fascinating place. And we had William Tarn in the 1940s writing that he assumes that the Greeks colonized the Arabian Gulf because of their love of the sea and despite the intense heat. But he, in the 1940s, said we don't have any remains to prove that. That, of course, had changed. So, for instance, we see here on the left side this small but very impressive Hellenistic temple on the island of Failaka in Kuwait. And, of course, we see on the right side the magnificent remains of Alexandria on the Tigris, or Charax-Spasinu, which is covering a huge amount in terms of square meters. And the city walls are still so impressive that the Iraqi army used them as part of their defenses during the war with Iran in the 1980s. So there are remains, and therefore there is also a hope that we might find some Arab elements associated with it. Interestingly, we found a very interesting phenomena which makes it very difficult to trace Arabs in that area. So, for instance, if we stick with Charax-Spasinu for a minute or two, we find a large-scale study conducted by Monika Schuol about the Caracanes. And then she noticed that the settlement was in the Arab area, but otherwise does not identify any other Arab aspects with it. And despite Strabo writing in the geography that Charax-Spasinu was a settlement of the Arabian Messeni. And interesting to see then Jan Rezzo in his book Arabs in Antiquity is very skeptical about the Arab element in that area, and he uses a technique which I call deconstruction of the Arab element. It is there, but it's not there in a way. So he, and allow me to quote, says that Hispazoines, the king of Charax-Spasinu, is then said to have been the king of the bordering Arabs. They must be those living in the part of Arabia stretching along the Persian Gulf, deriving their Arabness from their habitat in Arabia, not from actually being Arabs. So, unquote. So we have this interesting phenomena that it is very difficult to locate and to label Arabs as such. And even if you have indications by ancient historians, modern authors are much more skeptical about that. And of course here, Irfan Shahid was, for my purposes, very helpful. And of course, other people might strongly disagree with him here. And very early in his book, Rome and the Arabs, he made this very interesting quote here saying, you know, historians in modern times have used various terms, labels to designate Arabs of the Orient and the Roman period, such as Semitic, Aramean, Syrian, etc. Something could be said for the application of those terms in the view of the fact that the Arabs, of course, were Semites, that they were in some respects Aramicized and did in fact live in Syria. So this is a problem which you encounter when you face this fascinating stretch of history. Then, of course, the question was, why is it so difficult to label Arabs in this time phrase, timeline? And of course, we find here an interesting debate about the label of Semitic languages. And this label, of course, was invented by a German, von Schlötzer. He lived in the 18th century, and he was a genius. He did many things. He was a historian, a linguist, and in his pastime, he obviously invented a label for a language family where he found that those languages have similarities. And so he took from the Bible the term Semitic languages. And even 200 years later, the great German Semitist Theodor Nöldeke was very clear that this label is very artificial. But Nöldeke goes on saying, and I quote here, as there are no natural labels for large linguistic or population groups, because the groups themselves are unaware of their own relationships, science must create artificial names for the purpose, and it would be a good thing if all such names were as concise and clear as this one. And of course, if you look at the way Arab historians and Arab linguists see it, then this is completely different. So, for instance, the Arab linguists say, from all we know is that the Semitic languages seem to come from Southern Arabia. So why don't we do what we always do and call the languages according to the region where they have emerged? And of course, this is not the case here. So why do the Arabs say, why do we have to resort to a term that is artificial and conceals the notion that this is an Arab language family? Although everybody seems to agree on the topic that Arabic, as it is now, is very close to the Ur-Semitic language. And we find here something very, very interesting. The Arab historians complain that something very peculiar happens in this situation. And I would call again a kind of deconstruction of the Arab element to an extent that it somehow disappears. So I quote Ahmed Aqal, a Kuwaiti scientist, and I translated from Arabic to English. And they say that the Orientalists, the Western Orientalists, of course, used the term peoples to designate tribes in order to give the impression that they were separate civilizations. They called the individual dialects languages, even though they knew that regional variation of the pronunciation of the same word does not imply the existence of separate languages. It is astonishing that wherever they found a new city or a village, they immediately identified it as a new civilization. This does not happen anywhere else in the world. On the contrary, scholars elsewhere actively seek out similarities and pattern between even distant regions, as it is as if the largely flat and level Arab region was somehow fragmented. And even, I would go even further, even if we find traces of languages and inscriptions, which is of course a rare thing, then they are also deconstructed in a very similar way. So I found this interesting article by Michael MacDonald. And Michael MacDonald, of course, describes here the thousands and thousands of Safavidic inscriptions which were found in the Arab area. And here something very interesting happens. Of course, it takes some time to figure out that Safavidic is related to Arabic, and if you speak Arabic, you probably would have understood Safavidic. So it's not a completely different languages, but a related language, perhaps even a dialect. And then something very interesting happens again if you care to read the first line of his article. He says then, we are thus faced with the curious paradox of a non-literate society in which large numbers of people could read and write. A society in which literacy, having apparently no useful place, seems largely to have been used as a pastime. And this, as a political science, I find very, very fascinating. So there are inscriptions, you find them everywhere, but they have no use. So they are there because of artistic reasons, or people were bored, and so they used inscriptions and they used language to pass their time. That is, of course, very, very intriguing and very, very peculiar. And of course, if the Arabs did not have a language, if they did not have a culture, if they did not have a script, then how on earth can you identify them? It makes it very, very difficult. It makes it very, very difficult. Then the next step, I try to figure out, if there were Roman Arabs playing a role in the empire, could we sense or can we trace any kind of Arabness with them? And I found Lukian, of course, very intriguing, and this was pointed out also by Glenn Bowersock. And there is this, of course, Lukian, the author of the True History, and the True History and he remarks on the first side that everything that is written in the True History is, of course, a lie, and therefore everything that is written, said here, is not true. And in this book, a very interesting episode happens. So the protagonist walks on this beautiful island and he meets Homer. And he starts talking to Homer and discussing with him. The question was, where do you actually come from? And then Homer, to total surprise, says, actually, I'm a Babylonian, and my fellow countrymen called me not Homer but Tigranes. And later, when I was a hostage, Homeros in Greek, among the Greeks, I changed my name. So, of course, this is making fun. This is a joke, but the joke could only work if the audience of Lukian knew that the Greek culture had some roots also in the Middle East, namely in Babylonia. So this was the only way this could have worked. And of course, Lukian called himself also Assyrian, and that went to the extent that the German linguists in the 19th century singled him out in a way, saying, this is one of the typical Syrians who pretended to be a Hellenistic author, but the Hellenism here only reaches as far as his epidermis. The next, so there are some indications here of this Arab element, but of course very hard to trace. The next step would then be, of course, to say, can we trace any Arab elements with the Roman rulers that had Arab roots? And here it is interesting, for instance, to see with people like Philippus Arabs and Alexander Severus, Caracalla, Elagabal, that they have been portrayed in the 19th century, not earlier, but in the 19th century, mainly by German scholars, in a very negative way, and in a very, I must say, anti-Semitic way, because the German scholars, mainly von Domasiewski, they keep wondering how those Arabs assumed such important position in the Roman Empire, and they make them responsible for a flood of Orientalistic values, concepts, religious ideas that seem to flood Rome at that time. So they do not understand it, and they describe them, of course, and usually in very, very negative terms. The interesting thing to see is that modern historians go out of their way to explain that those rulers in no way acted as Arabs. But they try to be, and I quote a German historian here, they try to be as Roman as any Romans could be. Nevertheless, of course, there's this interesting topic that the three Arab emperors had some kind of inclination towards monotheistic ideas. And that was, of course, something which the pagan historians of that time did not perceive as something very, very, very positively. So, although one interesting thing here is, of course, that Julia Domna, which we have here, you see the picture here, one of the most powerful Syrian empresses of the Severian dynasty. Probably she was responsible more than her son Caracalla for initiating the Constitutio Annontignata in 212. And this edict made it possible for freemen in the Roman Empire to obtain a citizenship. And of course, we can speculate whether the ethnic character of her family made this for her a very important kind of measure. We can assume that. The next topic, then, I was trying to figure out, if it's also very difficult to trace Arabness among the Arab rulers, although one can find interesting anti-Semitic attributes towards them, especially by German scholars. what about Roman Arab resistance to the Roman Empire? Can we trace anything there? And of course, we have here 3 episodes. One is Avidius Cassius, the Syrian legate, who was a Syrian. We have, of course, the famous Queen Zenobia, and we have the Bedouin Queen Mavia. And we can trace some sort of Arab elements in all those uprisings. Of course, they were very different. So Avidius Cassius was revolting against Mark Aurel. And when we read Cassius Dio, we found very little, let's say, racial slur against Avidius Cassius, although it is, of course, remarked that he was a Syrian and not a Roman. What is interesting, though, is that Cassius Dio relates to us a speech given by Marcus Aurelius to his troops before the battle against Cassius. And here Marcus Aurelius says, and I quote, "For surely Cilicians, Syrians, Jews, and Egyptians have never proved superior to you and never will." So at least from Mark Aurel's side, there was a perception that this revolt was an Asian one. It probably was not an Arab one for him, but it was an Asian one. So we can sense some kind of sensibility here when it comes to the question of whether the Arabs were somehow being remarked on by others. With Zenobia, of course, it's a different question. She did not try to take over the entire power of the Roman Empire, as Avidius Cassius was obviously trying, but she was in a quarrel with another Arab tribe, the Tanuks, and who even Rome itself had so far been unable to contain. And so it was probably more a struggle between her and this Arab tribe. And at the end, the Emperor Aurelian had to interfere. But in the Arabic tradition, that's interesting, it was not Aurelian, but it was the Tanukin Amr ibn Adi who defeated her. And of course, he made something out of that. And we can see that Amr's son, the famous Imr al-Qais, was recorded as the king of all of Arabs in the famous Namara inscription later on. It's also a little bit different with Mavia, and here, for instance, Bowersock and Irfan Shahid are not clear why this was an uprising. So there was obviously a contract between the Romans and her tribe, so they were a federati. And when Mavia's husband died, obviously this feudus had to be renegotiated. And obviously here the Arian Emperor Valens had a problem with the Orthodox Christian Mavia. And so there was a struggle, and at the end of the day, this was settled, however. And what is interesting is that Valens sent an Arab bishop called Moses to her, and that might also be not a coincidence. So why do you send somebody who speaks Arabic into this area? So obviously the Arabness played some kind of factor. And of course we have Greek historians like Sozomen who tell us that at the time the Arabs composed poems and songs about Mavia. So we have some traces here, very interesting traces. Another question which I was trying to settle out was, when I put another way, when I wrote the book in 2014, that was the time when there were 1 million Syrians leaving their country, and they literally walked to Germany. And so many people at that time, they assumed that this is a very novel thing. Migration from the Arab world to the Mediterranean to Europe was considered to be a very novel thing. When you go back and to the records, it's that is not the case, and you find it very interesting. For instance, maybe to know that cities in Spain like Malaga, Cartagena, Seville, Cordoba had substantial Arab minorities during the Roman times. In Italy, you had cities like Puteolo and Ostia with also substantial minorities there. And Marseille, Bordeaux, the same. You have the interesting case of a Syrian bishop called Eusebius, who was recorded to having built a schola for his fellow Syrians in Paris in the 5th century. So that was nothing new. But of course, the Arab traces there faded into the background, and my hypothesis was because those Arabs sooner or later became Christian, they found it very easy to integrate into the Christian societies of Europe, and that was, of course, very difficult, very different with their cousins, the Jews, who stick to the religion of their forefathers and were therefore always, let's say, easier detectable than the Arabs, who sooner or later became part of the European societies there. The question then I had is, there's 1,000 years. There are interesting episodes. There is this notion of an cultural sphere, of a common language, or rather of related languages and dialects. And the interesting thing here is that in many aspects, this history seems to have been disappeared. And of course, that is not true. And memories always remain. And I picked out 3 interesting examples. One is here in Berlin, in the Pergamon Museum, we have the Mushata Palace, which probably was built in the early Islamic time. And you see here this fascinating mixture of Arabic and Hellenistic and Roman architecture. It's absolutely impressive. And in the middle, I also live in Vienna, and in the St. Stephen's Dome, the main church, we have a small room, and in the small room there are the relics of 2 Arabian saints, Cosmas and Damian, medical saints. And the funny story for me was that until the 1930s, the Austrian or the Viennese doctors met in front of the St. Stephen's Dome and carried the artifacts of the 2 Catholic saints in a procession around the dome two or three times. And I found the idea funny that those people, probably at that time, many of them being anti-Semitic, were carrying around two saints who probably were very likely were Arabs. So history is there, but few people understand them. And a big exception, of course, was somebody like Taha Hussein, who in the 1930s, and I found that also very intriguing, was very, very well aware that there is this 1,000 years of common history of the Arabs in the Roman Empire. And then he suggested in 1930 to put Latin and Greek into the curriculum of the Egyptian school. And of course, that didn't happen. What I found interesting as well is that the older Western historians had a very different view, in my perception, on the Arabs. It was considered to be a more of an integral development, and it was considered to be a common historical space of European and Arab history, very much more so than today. So something. My assumption, something must have happened, and must have happened recently. And until I could not figure out what it was until I read the book from Garth Fowden, Before and After Muhammad, and he points to a very interesting episode. And this episode plays in the time of the Great War and shortly after it. He assumes, or he describes the story of Karl Becker. Karl Becker, a German diplomat and also linguist, and Karl Becker wanted to embrace Islam in the Arab world, partly because of the geopolitical role that the Arabs played at that time, but also Karl Becker stressed the continuity of the development from Alexander the Great to Islam. That is something which today is considered very unusual. The only reason, according to Becker, why there was a split between the Arab culture and the Western culture was, and that is funny to read to some extent, and I quote here, that the Renaissance made it possible to get rid of Greek classicism and Oriental metaphysical religion, and it paved the way, so Becker, for the introduction of Germanic ideals directly derived from true classicism. So Of course, if it wouldn't have been for the German ideals, this would have not happened, but it happened. And interesting to see that Becker was a colleague of another German historian and also diplomat, Max von Oppenheim. And Max von Oppenheim, both he and Becker, they were working at the German Foreign Office. And during the First World War, they composed a memorandum for jihad. So that was the German idea of using the Arabs and the Arab sentiments, which they felt were very close to them to some extent, and in order to mobilize forces against the Entente. And of course, interesting to see that somebody like Max von Oppenheim, who was half Jewish, he reintroduced this idea in 1940, but of course, with the defeat of Rommel at El Alamein, this became obsolete. So at least till this time, and in some circles, the Arab world and Europe were as close as it could be. And then something happens shortly after the war, and Grasfreuden described this with the following. He said that, you know, mainly French historians were trying to find, or were discussing an approach where they would define clear borders between the Europe world and the barbarian world. And of course, there was then an intense discussion between the German historians and the French historians on whether the Germanic invaders contributed anything worthwhile to the Roman Empire. And of course, the French thought this was not the case. But then it took a Belgian like Henri Perrin, and he posthumously, it was his book Mohammed and Charlemagne, which was published. And in this book, he had a very interesting notion, and he said, you know, that it was even after West Rome was defeated, that the patterns of the Roman way of life still continued, and it was only with the victory of Islam that those patterns became raptured. And then he says something interesting happens, namely that the Latin world would turn on itself and substituted Frankish roughness for the old Mediterranean shine. So it was more or less the fault or the effect of the Islamic invasion that there were rulers like Charlemagne who could not read and write, who suddenly became the right people to be in the place. And if you extend the argument even further, you can say that maybe then the Islamic invasion or the Islamic victory were responsible also for the carnage of the Great War, because it had turned the European powers against itself, and they have lost their sophisticated culture and politics. So there was a split after that, despite, as Frauden observes, the desperate pleas from people like Karl Becker to do it otherwise, but it then happened. And of course, there's also a religious explanation for the split. And one of them was put forward by Philip Jenkins, a religious person. And he assumed that with the loss of Palestine, in a geographical sense, Christianity has no heart and no natural core any longer. It's lost its core territories. And therefore, Christianity had to be reinvented as a Western or as a kind of Atlantic religion, to the extent that all roots of the Middle East, and that would include also the Arab Christians, were need to be left behind. They became the other. They had to become the other. And in this context, of course, a common history doesn't make any sense. It had to be a different history. It had to be a different history. It had to be relabeled. It had to be told with another narrative. And of course, my assumption then, therefore, there were two important notions coming out of this. One was arrogance, and the other one was fear. And those resulted from the events around the Islamic victories at Yarmouk. And of course, arrogance and fear, they help each other in a certain way. And arrogance and fear, because, you know, I think at some time, people in Europe had the impression that this was very close. The Arabs could have invaded also the rest of the European world, and therefore something had to be done. And what I found then a bit unsettling, of course, is of course, these events happened long time ago, but how and why do we still use this narrative, and why do we still use the pictures from a so long gone history, use it in a very contemporary political debate? And it still remains a point which I cannot fully explain. But of course, a very good example of this happens when you look at the discussion about the clash of civilization. And here somebody like Bernard Lewis, who is a historian, he wrote something very remarkable in the 1990s, and allow me to read it for you. This is no less than a clash of civilization, the perhaps irrational, but surely historic reaction of an ancient rival against our Judeo-Christian heritage. So it's very interesting what he does. You know, one, of course, he goes back to history saying, okay, this has been here before. And therefore, it is relevant for us, and therefore there will be no quick victory, as he assumes. On the other hand, you see also those pictures like Arabs being irrational, which he implies here, and also very interesting to see that he says Islam and Arabs on one side and Judeo-Christianity on the other side. Although from everything we know about the end of Rome in the Near East was that rather the Jews sided with the Arabs, as they were terribly prosecuted by the Roman authorities at that time. So I found that very unsettling. And I, of course, asked myself the question, why is that possible? And if you look at the current political context, then it is interesting to see that the situation today is not totally different from that back in the Roman times. So the borders or the periphery of the European Union, for instance, are very much the same as they were in the Roman Empire. So the peripheries are more or less identical. You have the Limes Africanus in North Africa and Egypt. You have the Limes Arabicus in Palestine and Jordan and Turkey. And of course, what happened recently is that there were two holes in this periphery. One is in Libya, which as a modern state is now seemed to exist. Now we have very different factions there. And of course, the other big hole in the Libes was Syria. And in both instances, you see a very similar discussion from the one that people like Procopius or Ammianus had. So one is, again, this fear of losing control. There had to be a new institution founded by the European Union for defending the borders. And of course, the border is not only the European borders, but also the borders on the related Arab countries that are participating here. And interesting for me to see also that, again, you had the description of the otherness. The Arabs suddenly became the barbarians. Again, very similar as Ammianus would have described them, and they had to be kept at bay. And the final point I want to make is there are, as a political scientist, also interesting to see there are some patterns which are very persistent. So, for instance, you have the current Arab military class, which is taking up a role very similar to that of the Foederati, the Arab Christian tribes allied with Rome. So, for instance, you have countries like Egypt and Lebanon and Jordan, where the defense budget is paid entirely by the United States. And of course, it is expected then from this military class to perform a kind of duty. And even if the state does no longer exist, like in Libya, then there's still a group which has to configure the Libyan Coast Guard. And of course, the role of the Libyan Coast Guard, which is paid for by the European Union, is not to protect the Libyan coast, but of course to prevent refugees from leaving the Libyan coast for the Arab area. So that is interesting for me to see that the Roman history is not a thing of the past, and that we have this interesting upload of pictures and narratives from this period into our current debate. And this is possible because the political situation, with all differences acknowledged, seems to be very similar. So finally, some conclusions, and thank you very much for bearing with me. There is this history of the Arabs fear before Islam, and the integration of Arabs into the Roman Empire is a story that is difficult to tell because it's very contradictory. It doesn't make sense in the colonial, imperial, and Oriental, and even religious context. It doesn't make sense. It's a clear contradiction. So therefore, the Kultur nation of before Islam is something that the Western historians are very reluctant to talk about. If there is a role of the Arabs at all, it is rather a negative one, and it even goes so far as to forget Arabs and Christian Arabs and the role they played, for instance, in transporting Christianity towards India and China. And of course, this creates then interesting contradictions. So you have writing illiterates, as we talked about, you have a surprising victory. So the Arabs come out of nowhere and suddenly win this victory. Not only that, is that the victory was also very easy, as it was said once. It didn't take very much. And the population of the Roman areas of the Roman Orients, they integrated into the Islamic Empire with more or less ease. Interesting also then for me to see the contemporary political situation stimulates selective and biased narrative uploads, Procopius, Ammianus, and others, by people who know history and obviously play with this kind of narrative. The 1,000 years of history have not been, common history between the West and Arabs have not been completely forgotten, of course, but there was a continuous separation. Christianity as an Atlantic religion had to restart, so to say, completely from new, and had to forget its traces and its sources in the Arab world. You have people like Pirenne, you have the clash of cultures. And as you can see, this is a very complex structure. This is a very, very complex political, historical edifice. And it requires, I would say, some kind of gatekeeping. And therefore, it was not a surprise for me to see that the gatekeepers mainly come from the West. And if there are people like Irfan Shahid, who although he was an Arab, was working in an American university, they always have to, all their work is they have to defend it against the notion that they are trying to recreate a nationalistic kind of past that did not exist. Though by saying that, I want to thank you very much for bearing with me, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Al-Ani, for this very engaging and thought-provoking presentation. So we can open the floor now. So if there are any comments, questions, either raise your hand or type your question in the chat. We have a raised hand from Matthew Ong.
Yeah, hi. You had mentioned that in late antiquity in Europe, particularly like around the Mediterranean region, like in Spain, that there were essentially Arabic-speaking communities. So into late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. And in the like, what do the sources say? Like, how are they tracked through that period? Because you mentioned that they sort of assimilated, but did that mean that they simply gave up Arabic? And if they did, why didn't they do it earlier? Or
first of all, it's probably not known whether they spoke Arabic, but what is mainly recorded is that they spoke Aramaic. So we have two sources about that. Of course, we have the Arabic soldiers of the Roman legions, which were sent from the Arab areas to the Germanic borders. So you have some kind of influence there. But the sources I have seen, and it was people like Henri Pirenne, it was Warwick Ball, for instance, who had written extensively about this. It was not clear to me. It's somehow around the 6th or 7th century, this seems to fade. So the records of people speaking Arabic, Aramaic in the cities I mentioned in Italy and Spain and France seems to cease. And something must have happened. And my hypothesis was that they became so integrated. And of course, Christianity helped them to integrate into the European societies, that they were not longer traceable as a separate unit, as in contrast to the Jewish people who made the same travels and journeys, but because they stick to their religion, you could always distinguish them to a sense.
And that would have included their language variant of Aramaic, or
sorry,
that they would have stopped speaking, that they would have stopped being a distinctive linguistic community.
That's not it's a remarkable phenomena. You have that phenomena that if the language is not used, then after 1 or 2 generations, it simply stops.
Peter Grant.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, I learned a great deal from this presentation, Dr. Ayed, and I am speaking as a modernist. My impression is that part of what you call the sort of ambiguity or unresolved nature of things has to do, at least in the English-American context, with the role that Hegel plays in how we construct knowledge. And I place a lot of weight on that in terms of understanding history. Hegel, frankly, didn't know what to do with Islam because it didn't fit his Rise of the West structure. So it was sort of a very uncomfortable kind of thing. It came after he'd already sort of used up a certain time frame for other purposes. And so the identity dimension comes in at this point in time. If we want to be Westerners and keep this sort of Rise of the West thing going, then Hegel is basically, our logical person to sort of turn to, and he constructs our universities, as you know. That said, possibly, at least for Americans, the future is not necessarily that we will have the same identity in another generation. So maybe what you're doing speaks to our next generation more than it does this generation. In other words, we're in the slow process of becoming North Americans. We're in the slow process of sort of acknowledging indigenous people, Chinese, Africans, so on and so forth. Being Western is going to erode. At the moment, however, that tradition is the tradition in the university, and I think that's why so many things remain unanswered, is because in a certain sense there's no way to fit them with the way Hegel wrote philosophy of history. Thank you. That's my sort of quick reaction. But again, thank you very much for a very enlightening talk.
Thank you very much. Your comment makes absolutely sense to me.
Any other comments or questions? George?
So thank you very much. Yeah, this is really fascinating. Usually books pass by me towards the end of the pipeline at Gorgias, and when your book came across, I said to the staff, okay, leave it on the side, I want to read it. So the title was fascinating, and I was fascinated by reading it as well. I also read much earlier Trimmingham's about Christians amongst the Arabs before Islam, and most recently Peter Webb's Imagining the Arab. I don't know if you came across it, the Arab identity and the rise of Islam. Of course, one gets different pictures from each of these books. And that maybe depends also on how the reader is looking at this thing. So when I'm reading Tringham, although it's talking about Christianity amongst the Arabs before Islam, I'm reading it more of a Syriac history. There is so much in his book about Syriac Christianity amongst the Arabs, and of course, comparing your book to Webb's book, it's almost kind of an opposite view of things. So my question to you is, did you think about the reader's perspective when compiling your work, and maybe in your view, how it differs from Birmingham and from Webb?
Well, of course, as I tried to mention at the beginning, it's a very personal journey. Like every book is at the end of the day something very personal. But I try to bring a new perspective in here, and of course, for me, it's a disadvantage of not being a historian, and then suddenly I have to deal with linguistics. I have to deal with how history is written and perceived and things like that. But I found it as a political scientist, for instance, very interesting to find out what questions have not been asked, or what kind of topics have been omitted. So, for instance, this deconstruction still fascinates me, although I must admit, as a non-historian, I have to be very careful here. But to be so sure to discontinue this label of Arabs as a cultural element because then you say they were not Arabs, but they were Semites. And how can you expect that this makes more sense? Because no people or no person on earth ever said I'm a Semite, because this is an artificial kind of thing. So why is that so fast? Why is that going into such a peculiar kind of way? And what I also found very fascinating is that what Peter Grant mentioned before is that once the scientific process and the scientific world gets to work on this topic, it rather deconstructs the elements farther away, and every dialect becomes a language, and then it's very difficult to get them together. So I was trying, as you said, to do directly the opposite. I tried to do directly the opposite of that. And what I found very interesting is that then suddenly things make more sense. So you do not have this question of was the Quran a forgery of not? So if people had contact with scripts and languages, and there is a history of a common language that spans for hundreds of years, then the Quran is no surprise. So suddenly many things that historians have found very questionable are very easy or easier explainable if you take on this view to accept that there was a Arab sphere, and many Arabs, of course, they did not call themselves Arabs, but they said, I'm a member of this and that tribe. And that was also interesting thing that Gustav von Grünebaum mentioned. He said, what he found interesting is that Arabs at that time do accept that other people are Arabs, but they would not call themselves Arabs. So just like if you ask somebody from Saudi Arabia, where does he come from? He would say, I'm a Saudi, right? And so that was for me a very interesting story, and I'm still intrigued by it, and I still find it very, very disturbing, I must say. It's very uneasy to think about such a fantastic, fascinating stretch of history, 1,000 years, that has been, let's say, treated in this way, and also in a way to fuel a contemporary conflict. And this makes me very uneasy, and I have no easy questions or answers to that one. I try to give them, but of course they are tentative, and I have to accept all errors that goes along with that.
Thank you.
Michael McDonald.
You have to, you're on mute.
Sorry, is that better? Can you hear me now? Yes. Thank you very much for your lecture. I think there are several things that we need to take into account. One is the fact that from the 9th century BC onwards, which it was in the 9th century BC that we first hear of an Arab in history, we only know of Arabs from other people, because Arabic was an unwritten language, except at one stage by these nomads who used it for graffiti. And so when people like the Nabateans, for instance, wanted to write, they spoke Arabic, but they wrote in Aramaic. And unfortunately, because of the climate, we have only a handful of Nabatean papyri, and they're all legal documents. So we don't have any histories or mythology or literature. And it's only really when the Nabatean script, Aramaic script, remained in Arabia, in the Hejaz, after the Romans became uninterested, shall we say, in that part of the province of Arabia, that people stopped bothering to learn Aramaic language and just started writing Arabic in this, and hence it became the Arabic script. So the problem from all this is that we actually don't have any ancient literature from the Arabs themselves, the people who were called Arabs and presumably called themselves Arabs. We don't even know what distinguished somebody as an Arab. I have put forward the theory that these multiple Arabias all over the Levant, which are described by various Greek and Roman historians and the Assyrians, the only thing that all these very different peoples with very different ways of life could have shared is the language. But that's purely a hypothesis, of course. So it's very difficult to say what actually made somebody say that they were an Arab. And but at least we know that there were Arabs, people who called themselves Arabs, who were called Arabs by other people. And I think that's very important. The whole idea of calling them Semites is to me a Nazi thing, I'm afraid. It's a completely irrelevant. Semitic is a linguistic term, as was Aryan, but it's and we should forget that. I think they were definitely Arabs. And the final thing I would say is that the irony is that until about the 2nd century AD, so 1,000 years after the first mention of an Arab, all the places where Arabs are mentioned are in the Levant, none of them in Arabia. And the only reason that the Greeks thought that the frankincense came from Arabia was because the Arab merchants brought it up from about midway up the Hejaz to the markets in the north. And so the Greeks and the Romans associated the frankincense with Arabs, and therefore assumed the Arabs actually created it, or I mean, grew it and harvested it. Anyway, I'll stop talking. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. It's very nice talking to you, by the way. Thank you for this comment. I absolutely understand this. Despite these difficulties, I could say with some imagination, there is a different narrative possible. And the only point I was trying to make is I acknowledge all the difficulties. I acknowledge all the deficits when it comes to relicts and languages and scripts and whatever. But there is a narrative that is still possible, that is going in a more intricate way, that allows more for an Arab element in that history. That is all what I'm trying to say. And I picked some examples. Some might be right, some might be wrong, which I found very remarkable. And if they are treated with another interpretation, they would make the history of the Arab before Islam, let's say, more logical, with less let's say discussions about forgeries and surprises which nobody understands how it would come, etc., etc. So that was the point I was trying to make.
Well, thank you very much.
I thank you.
We have one probably last question from Amani Abdirazak.
Yeah, right. Hello, good evening. Thank you, Dr. Ayani, Professor Ayani, for such informative, enlightening lecture. I have just one question. I'm not sure whether you you talked about it or not, about the idea of discourse and the counter discourse between the East and the West. You just mentioned that you were trying to find where exactly the idea of Orientalism came from. Did you find something that we can call a counter narrative, Occidentalism before Western modernity, and what could be the main remarks of such a discourse or a counter discourse?
Can you I'm sorry, can you perhaps repeat the last the traces of a counter discourse?
A counter discourse to Orientalist discourse. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. And I think I had not found it when I wrote the book. I had the impression that sometimes people like Irfan Shahid were part of a counter discourse. So although that's interesting for me to see that Irfan Shahid did see himself as part of the Western historical community. So he dedicated one of his books to Nöldeke, for instance. So he saw himself not outside, but inside. And he did not go as far as I did sometimes, where I criticize viewpoints, but he was simply telling the story with a stronger Arabic emphasis. And that, of course, one can criticize, and it has been criticized. Now there is a recent development with anti-colonialism, and that's a very recent development. I'm not into that one too much, but I would assume that it somehow will affect the topic under discussion here. So, for instance, if you read about the Haitian history, then this topic of those people do not have a language and they don't have a history, that seems to be part of a colonial kind of discourse. But I must admit, I had not taken this into account at that time when I wrote the book. But it would be interesting to see if this anti-colonialism has anything to contribute to the topics we discussed here. I'm looking forward to that.
Well, thank you very much. This is fascinating. So I guess we can look forward to the next book where you are going to treat this. And thank you very much all for coming. And I'm turning over to George. George, unmute yourself.
Yes, sorry. I just unmuted. Thank you. This is really a great talk, fascinating. And thank you, Zabine and Maria for also co-hosting for the Institute for Advanced Study. As I said, this was the third of 4 talks, and the 4th talk will be coming up in December. I don't know if Gemma is here to say something about it. It's
yes.
On the screen.
Yes, I'm here.
And Gemma is the organizer behind the scenes. So, we're good because of Gemma.
Yes. Thank you very much to Ayad for today. That was a fascinating lecture. And yes, we have one more left in the series for this year. So on December the 8th, same time, Hila Aluf-Aboudi will be presenting her work that will explore the nature of alaya, traditions in rabbinic literature and their connection to the wisdom tradition. So she'll be examining diverse traditions in connection to the wisdom and apocalyptic traditions. And she hopes to shed light on the manner in which Elijah's role developed in rabbinic literature. I will put the registration link in the chat for anyone that's interested in that. And thank you to everyone who came today. And of course, thank you to our hosts and organizers.